Today, we're exploring the baffling case of a young man who arrived from India to stay just 2 weeks in his cousin's Brampton home only to vanish from the basement without warning. He was new to Canada, unfamiliar with the city, and relied entirely on the married couple hosting him. But soon after his arrival, something in that household shifted: late-night footsteps, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and a growing closeness between the young visitor and the husband that no one could quite explain. When the man suddenly disappeared, leaving all his belongings untouched, those quiet signs took on a much darker meaning, and investigators quickly realized this wasn't simply a missing person case, but the beginning of a far more tangled and secretive story. For several years, Ahanvar Suryavansh and his wife Taruni maintained a routine that rarely changed. They lived in a modest semi-detached house on a quiet street in Brampton. Both had demanding but predictable jobs. Ahanvar worked long shifts at a logistics yard handling incoming freight, while Taruni coordinated schedules at a dental clinic. They usually returned home tired, ate late dinners, completed household tasks, and watched television for a short time before bed. Their days followed such a regular structure that even small deviations stood out. Friends described their life as stable, almost rigid, shaped by habits built over a decade. This pattern shifted the night Ahanvar received a call from his uncle in Ahmedabad. The message was straightforward. The uncle's younger son, Nihal, had been accepted into a short technical certification program in Ontario and needed temporary lodging. The uncle said it would be for just 2 weeks, long enough for Nihal to arrange his documents, find a rental room, and adjust to transit routes. Ahanvar agreed immediately. Housing a relative was a common expectation within their extended family. When he relayed the request to Taruni, she accepted it without hesitation, viewing it as a simple family obligation. Nihal arrived 2 days later. He appeared shy, quiet, and overwhelmed by the cold weather. This was his first time outside India, and he seemed unfamiliar with local systems. Taruni set up the basement room for him, placing extra blankets and a small heater inside. She later told investigators that her first impression was positive. He was polite, soft-spoken, and grateful. For the first week, he spent most of his time figuring out public transit, attending orientation sessions, and handling paperwork required for new students. During those first days, the household felt livelier. Meals became slightly more social. Nihal asked questions about Canadian customs, local transportation, and grocery items he had never seen before. Ahanvar appeared energized by his cousin's presence, explaining things, offering advice, and recounting his own early experiences after immigrating. Taruni did not see any cause for concern. She viewed the shift as normal and temporary. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What she didn't notice immediately were subtle changes in her husband's schedule. At first it seemed harmless. After dinner, instead of relaxing in the living room, Ahanvar began spending more time downstairs, stating that Nihal needed help with assignments or needed guidance about the job market. Taruni accepted these explanations. But after several evenings, she realized that he stayed there even after the supposed study sessions were over. On multiple nights, he remained in the basement long past midnight. She sometimes woke to hear footsteps moving below her floorboards or hushed voices she couldn't make out through the ceiling. When asked about it later, she told officers that the footsteps were soft, almost cautious, as if the men were trying not to disturb her. She assumed Nihal simply felt more comfortable talking to Ahanvar than to her. When she casually asked what they discussed, both men responded with the same explanation: course anxiety, assignment pressure, or confusing instructions. Their answers were vague but not confrontational. They laughed in a relaxed way, giving her no immediate reason to push further. Still, the increased closeness between the two men felt unusual to her. Before Nihal arrived, Ahanvar had rarely spent extended time in the basement. Now it had become part of his nightly routine. He also started taking his tea downstairs instead of drinking it in the kitchen, a small but noticeable change. Taruni told investigators she felt a slight discomfort she couldn't fully explain. She tried to dismiss it, believing things would return to normal once Nihal found his own accommodation. In the final week of his supposed 2-week stay, the pattern remained the same: late evenings in the basement, quiet conversations, and a basement door that opened and closed at odd hours. Some nights, she heard it again near midnight as she lay in bed, the soft creak followed by steps descending. She chose not to intervene, assuming it would cause unnecessary tension. At that point, she viewed the situation as temporary and manageable, unaware of how these early shifts in routine would later be examined in detail by investigators trying to understand when the atmosphere in the house first began to change. In the weeks after Nihal settled into the basement, the atmosphere inside the house began to shift in a way that Taruni found difficult to define at first. She described it later as a pattern of small, unrelated details that eventually formed a picture. The first sign appeared early one morning when she woke unusually early for work. She reached across the bed out of habit and noticed that Hanver's side was colder than it should have been. It felt as though he had come back to bed only moments before she opened her eyes. When she asked him later, he gave a brief explanation about going for an early jog. The explanation was not unreasonable, but when she walked past the entryway, his running shoes were still aligned neatly against the wall, the laces tucked in the way she arranged them the previous night. They had not been moved. Around the same time, she started noticing changes in Nihal's behavior. He became more reserved around her and more careful about his movements. When she came downstairs to do laundry, he would either retreat quickly to his room or sit rigidly at his desk, avoiding eye contact. Yet whenever Hanver entered the space, Nihal relaxed visibly, sometimes even acting relieved. Their interactions had a level of coordination she hadn't seen earlier. Another detail added to her concern: the quiet exchanges she overheard late at night. The basement was directly beneath their bedroom, and on several occasions she woke to the sound of low voices. They were not raised or emotional, but measured, as if the speakers were deliberately keeping the volume down. When she approached the stairs to investigate, the voices cut off suddenly. The abrupt silence was more alarming than the whispering itself. It indicated awareness someone had heard her footsteps. At first she considered reasonable explanations. Nihal was new to the country, stressed about classes and housing, and may have needed emotional support from his older cousin. She tried to dismiss her anxiety as overthinking, but irregularities kept stacking up. One night, around 2 a.m, she left the bedroom to get a glass of water. As she passed the basement door, she noticed a thin beam of light glowing underneath. It disappeared within seconds. When she opened the refrigerator, she heard a soft click from below, like a door being gently closed. Later that week, while sorting recycling, she found several takeout containers she didn't recognize. She hadn't ordered anything. The containers were from a restaurant none of them frequented and appeared to have been hidden inside a bag beneath other waste. The dates on the stickers indicated late-night orders, placed at hours when she believed the house had been asleep. The turning point came one evening when she stepped outside to bring in the garbage bins. She saw Hanver standing behind the house, partially shielded by the corner of the wall, speaking urgently into his phone. His tone was clipped, and he kept glancing toward the driveway. When he saw her, he immediately ended the call. Without being asked, he said it was a coworker calling about shift changes. The explanation was short, almost mechanical. When they went back indoors, she noticed him clearing his call log before placing the phone on the counter. It was not a normal gesture for him. That night, she lay awake replaying the accumulation of unexplained movements, half-heard conversations, and evasive behavior. She considered other possibilities: health issues, work stress, problems with extended family, but none aligned with the secrecy she was observing. The colder bed, the silenced whispers, the hidden containers, the late-night basement activity, and the cleared call log pointed toward something more personal. By the end of that week, she reached a conclusion she had been trying to avoid: a Hanver might be hiding something from her, and the most logical explanation was that he was being unfaithful. Confrontation, she believed, would only push him further into defensiveness, so she chose a different approach. She began to watch quietly. She studied his movements, paid attention to Nihal's tension, and waited for one of them to make a mistake that would reveal what was actually happening beneath her floorboards. The following weeks brought a noticeable shift in the household dynamic. What had begun as quiet observation from Taruni turned into a palpable tension affecting every interaction. Routine conversations that once revolved around schedules, groceries, or work updates now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Even neutral questions from her about arrival times, weekend plans, or errands triggered defensive reactions from Ahanvar. He dismissed her questions as overreactions and repeatedly accused her of making problems where there were none. According to her later statement, he suggested she was letting coworkers influence her thinking or projecting insecurities onto him. His tone grew sharper, and he frequently ended conversations by leaving the room. At the same time, Nihal's behavior changed in a distinct, observable pattern. He began leaving the house early, often before dawn, without giving a specific destination. He returned late, usually after dark, and when he entered the home, he moved quietly, as if trying not to attract attention. If he encountered Taruni in the hallway or kitchen, he avoided eye contact and kept interactions minimal. She noticed that whenever she approached the basement stairs, his posture stiffened. His eyes would track her movements briefly before he looked away. This repeated behavior signaled a level of coordination with Ahanvar that had not been present before. The lack of transparency created an atmosphere where straightforward reasoning failed. Taruni believed that guessing would only lead her further into uncertainty. She decided the only way to understand what was happening was to address it plainly. One evening, during dinner, with all three present, she asked a direct but neutral question, whether anything was troubling either of them. She did not raise her voice, imply wrongdoing, or mention her suspicions. Her intention was to clarify the situation, not escalate it. The response from Ahanvar was immediate and disproportionate. He reacted with visible agitation and accused her of invading personal boundaries. He claimed she was creating tension in the house and disrupting peace. His reaction was so rehearsed and forceful that it stunned her. Even Nihal reacted by lowering his gaze and pushing his plate away. The moment created a silence that lasted through the rest of the meal. Afterward, Ahanvar left the table abruptly and spent the evening in the living room. Later that night, he fell asleep on the couch while watching television. His phone was placed beside him on the armrest. The earlier confrontation compelled Taruni to check the device, something she had resisted for weeks. She lifted it quietly and opened his call history. The log was empty. Text messages were empty. There were no recent conversations, no records of communication, an unrealistic state for someone with daily responsibilities, colleagues, and extended family. The complete absence of data did not look like natural activity but deliberate removal. She navigated deeper into the phone settings and noticed traces of several messaging apps that had been installed and deleted. Their icons were gone, but remnants appeared in the storage history. The pattern indicated repeated installation, usage, and removal. This discovery confirmed that some form of communication had occurred and that he had taken measures to conceal it. While scrolling, she heard movement below. Slow, measured footsteps in the basement. The steps were not random, they had a deliberate rhythm, as if the person was pacing or listening for activity upstairs. She returned the phone exactly where it had been and stepped away from the couch. From her position near the stairs, she heard two soft knocks, one from below and one answering tap from the living room floor. The sound was faint but distinct. It resembled a signal or a form of communication she had not heard before. She stood motionless at the top of the stairs, listening for any further movement. The basement door remained closed, but she could sense someone standing on the other side, waiting for her footsteps to retreat. The realization reinforced her suspicion that the secrecy between the two men extended beyond late-night conversations. Someone was monitoring her movements, adjusting their own behavior around them, and coordinating silently to avoid exposing whatever they were hiding. By the end of March, the tension inside the house had reached a level where even routine tasks felt strained. Communication between the three occupants had nearly stopped. Movements were predictable only in the sense that each person tried to avoid the others. When Taruni woke on a cold, overcast Thursday morning, she noticed something unusual. The house was too quiet. Normally she heard footsteps from the basement around that time, either Nihal preparing for his day or the faint sound of the basement door opening. But that morning, nothing moved. As she walked toward the kitchen, she saw Nihal's shoes still placed neatly by the entryway. He rarely left without them, especially in cold weather. The basement door was slightly open, angled in a way she had never seen before. It was not wide enough to indicate someone had walked through it recently, but it also wasn't properly shut. The position drew her attention immediately. She called down his name once, then again, louder. No response came from below. She went downstairs. The air felt still and untouched. Nihal's room appeared unusually tidy. The bed was made with precision, the corners tucked in tightly, which contradicted his usual rushed mornings. A half-finished notebook sat on the desk, open to a page filled with diagrams and partially written notes. His jacket, usually thrown over the chair, was gone. His backpack, which he took everywhere, was missing. There were no signs of disturbance, no knocked-over items, nothing out of place except the fact that he was gone without explanation. She returned upstairs and found Ahanver in the living room, preparing to leave for work. She asked him directly if he had seen Nihal that morning. His immediate reaction was a visible freeze. His hands paused mid-movement, and he hesitated before speaking. Then he said that Nihal had left early for a group project at his college. The words came out evenly, but the tone felt controlled, as though he had prepared the answer. Taruni sensed the inconsistency but did not argue. Hours passed, and Nihal did not return. She called his phone several times, each attempt went directly to voicemail. By early afternoon, her concern turned into alarm. She told Ahanver they needed to contact someone from Nihal's program to confirm whether he had attended class. Instead of cooperating, he grew irritated. He accused her of exaggerating the situation, said she was turning a small issue into chaos, and insisted it wasn't their place to interfere with an adult's schedule. His resistance made no sense. Nihal was new to the country, had limited contacts, and depended on them for basic support. Avoiding a welfare check seemed unreasonable. When she continued pressing, his irritation escalated into anger. He accused her of seeking drama and trying to control everyone's movements. This response solidified her fear that something was wrong. Despite his objections, she called the police and reported a missing person. She explained that the young man had disappeared without shoes, without his belongings, and without notifying anyone. Officers arrived within an hour. Their initial questions were straightforward: when he was last seen, what he had been wearing, whether he had medical or mental health concerns. They asked to look around the home to confirm there were no signs of struggle or self-harm. When the officers approached the basement stairs, Ahanver stepped forward and blocked the path. His tone shifted from annoyed to almost confrontational. He stated that the police had no right to enter private family spaces without a warrant. The officers paused, clarified that it was a voluntary welfare check, and withdrew, explaining they would proceed through formal channels. His behavior, however, was noted in their report. As evening fell, news of the disappearance reached extended family members. Calls came from India and across Ontario. As details circulated, speculation began. Some relatives suggested that tension between Taruni and Nihal had escalated. Others repeated claims that she had been acting jealous in recent weeks. The rumors spread quickly. What shocked Taruni most was not the accusations but the silence from her husband. He did not defend her, correct the claims, or reassure anyone. Instead, he stood apart from the conversations, staring repeatedly at the slightly open basement door, as if focusing on something only he could see. His distant posture suggested he was replaying events in his mind, events he was unwilling to share. That silence marked the moment when the situation shifted from confusion to crisis. Detectives arrived early the next morning, this time with a judicial warrant. The decision to obtain it came after they reviewed their preliminary notes from the previous day and flagged several inconsistencies in Ahanver's explanations about Nihal's last known movements. With the warrant in hand, they proceeded methodically, documenting each item removed from the home. They collected both men's phones, 2 laptops, an external hard drive, and the household router. They also removed the small home security camera mounted above the back entrance. According to Taruni, the device had been installed months earlier after a string of minor break-ins in the neighborhood. She told investigators she rarely thought about it afterward and assumed it hadn't recorded anything meaningful. Once the digital items were secured, technicians began pulling metadata, timestamps, and communication logs. The router, which stored local connection history, showed repeated late-night spikes in activity. The logs indicated that two specific messaging applications, both of which had since been deleted, were used consistently between midnight and 3 a.m. The connections came from both Hanver's and Nihal's devices. According to the usage pattern, the apps were activated shortly after the household lights typically went off. Investigators noted that the deletion of identical apps on both phones suggested coordinated action rather than coincidence. Attention shifted to the security camera. The footage was grainy, distorted in areas by condensation on the lens, but still usable. At 2:14 a.m., 2 nights before Nihal's disappearance, the camera captured motion in the backyard. Detectives extracted the sequence frame by frame. The video showed two figures, one matching Hanver's build, the other consistent with Nihal's height and posture. They appeared to be engaged in a heated confrontation. Their gestures were fast and sharp. Although audio was absent, the body language suggested an argument escalating beyond verbal disagreement. At one point in the footage, Nihal stepped backward abruptly. Detectives noted that his movement looked reactive, as if he had been pushed or startled. A few seconds later, the pair shifted out of the camera's range, moving toward the far edge of the yard. The footage then showed only snow and the dim light of a neighboring porch. Approximately 3 minutes later, a single figure returned into view, identified as Hanver based on clothing and gait. He walked with uneven steps, appeared winded, and his hands were visibly trembling as he moved back toward the house. This sequence was highlighted in the investigators' preliminary report as the behavior inconsistent with a routine interaction. Officers expanded the search area beyond the backyard. They followed a narrow pathway leading toward a drainage ravine located behind several homes. About 30 meters from the property line, they identified disturbed soil. The ground showed signs of recent compression, and patches of debris indicated movement through dense shrubbery. Behind a cluster of overgrown branches, detectives found a torn strip of dark fabric. Taruni later confirmed it resembled the lining of a jacket Nihal frequently wore. Investigators also noted drag marks in the soil, though the direction and origin point were not immediately clear. Back at the station, detectives began comparing the recovered digital evidence with Hanver's earlier statements. His explanations did not align with phone activity, router logs, or timestamped camera footage. When confronted with the discrepancies, he initially insisted he had been under stress and misremembered details. However, as investigators presented more precise data, his responses lost coherence. In a formal interview, under increasing pressure, he provided a partial admission. He stated that his relationship with Nihal had become complicated, using that word repeatedly. He described emotional dependency, secret conversations, and heightened anxiety about being discovered. He told detectives he believed Taruni had started noticing changes in the house and feared the situation would eventually surface. According to his statement, an argument between him and Nihal escalated when Nihal threatened to disclose the nature of their relationship, claiming he had nothing to lose. Hanver claimed that the confrontation seen on the camera was the moment tensions reached their peak. He said the fight intensified faster than he expected and got out of control. Although he did not provide a full account of the physical altercation, investigators documented his admission that the dispute involved more than verbal conflict. Based on the accumulated evidence, the deleted apps, the late-night communication pattern, the recorded confrontation, and the disturbed area near the ravine, detectives shifted their assessment of the situation. The case was no longer treated solely as a missing person report but as a potential incident involving foul play. As search teams prepared to re-examine the ravine area in greater detail, Hanver remained in an interview room, sitting motionless, staring down at the table, no longer offering explanations for the events captured on the camera. Search teams continued their work along the drainage ravine, focusing on the areas identified during the initial ground sweep. Conditions were difficult, with thick underbrush and unstable footing near the waterline. Late in the afternoon, a team member spotted fabric partially submerged downstream. When they reached the location, they found Nihal's body lodged between fallen branches along the edge of the water. The terrain suggested he had been carried some distance by the current. Officers documented the scene carefully, photographing the position of the body, nearby drag patterns, and the slope leading down from the ravine. The discovery confirmed that the case had moved from a missing person investigation to one involving a confirmed death. The autopsy was conducted the following day. The forensic pathologist reported a blunt force impact to the right side of the head. The injury was consistent with falling or being forced against a stone surface. There were no defensive wounds indicating a prolonged fight, but the report concluded that the impact had occurred close to the time of death. The findings aligned with the confrontation captured on the home security footage. Investigators presented the autopsy results to prosecutors, who determined that the evidence supported a charge of manslaughter rather than murder due to the absence of premeditation. The Crown formally charged DeHanver with manslaughter, citing not only the fatal encounter but also his actions after the event. Prosecutors emphasized a pattern of concealment, deletion of messaging applications, sanitizing call logs, avoiding cooperation with officers during the welfare check, and providing explanations that contradicted digital evidence. These actions demonstrated an awareness that something unlawful had occurred, even if the initial act itself was not planned. During pretrial interviews, DeHanver's legal counsel advised him to provide a detailed account. In his recorded testimony, he admitted that the relationship between him and Nihal had developed in secrecy and had reached a point where he felt trapped. He stated he feared that exposure would damage his marriage, create shame within his extended family, and jeopardize his position at work. According to his statement, the emotional pressure intensified over weeks until it became difficult for him to think clearly about consequences. He described the argument in the backyard as a culmination of accumulated stress. He said that when Nihal threatened to disclose their relationship, he panicked. He admitted to pushing him during the argument but claimed he did not anticipate the severity of the outcome. In court, prosecutors focused on the period after the confrontation. They argued that while the fatal injury might not have been intentional, the subsequent effort to hide communication records and mislead investigators demonstrated a deliberate attempt to evade accountability. They highlighted the contradiction between his initial claim that nothing unusual had happened and the evidence captured on the camera. They also pointed to his behavior during the police visit, particularly his refusal to allow officers into the basement without a warrant. Throughout the proceedings, which lasted 6 weeks, Taruni attended each session. She listened quietly as detailed timelines, messages, and digital traces were presented. For her, the testimony clarified the scale of the deception that had taken place inside her home. She learned about deleted apps, late-night communications, and hidden tensions that she had only partially suspected earlier. Witnesses described the relationship between the two men, the argument in the yard, and the sequence of movements that led to the night's outcome. She did not address the court, but her presence was noted by reporters and attendees. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge delivered a guilty verdict. In determining sentencing, the court considered the absence of premeditation but also acknowledged the seriousness of the concealment and the failure to seek help after the injury occurred. The judge stated that the custodial sentence reflected both the reckless actions during the confrontation and the deliberate evasion that followed. Following the legal proceedings, the property was formally transferred to Taruni. She decided to sell the house, stating that the environment had become inseparable from the events that unfolded inside it. After the sale was completed, she made arrangements to leave Canada. On the day of her departure, she boarded a flight from Toronto carrying only a single suitcase. According to her later statement, she chose to sever any remaining ties to the place where the situation had escalated and to start anew elsewhere.